Okay, so again, my name is James Hall, and just a little background on myself. I've been a wildlife biologist here at Plateau for 12 years now, and we started doing these great little presentations, which I think are really fun and interesting. So um, this is a big topic that I'm going to cover: how spring migration affects landowners. And it'd be a huge undertaking to cover all the bases on something like this, but I kind of consolidated this down into how it affects landowners from a management standpoint and some do's and don'ts and some, how that might relate to someone in wildlife management. So as I said, how spring migration affects landowners. And this is mostly related to birds. So as we all know, spring, typically starting in migration starting in late February, early March, as we head into the spring season. And, we get warmer temperatures here. It starts raining more. And part of that effect is it encourages songbird migration. So this is, once we get into spring through probably the end of May, that's kind of like the peak of migration for a variety of songbirds that breed here in Texas. So just a quick spiel. What is migration? Excuse me. Most of us are familiar with the word. It's the seasonal movement of an animal from one destination to another. And what's interesting is that it's a cycle. It's cyclical. In other words, these critters are moving long distances to a breeding destination, but they come back, and it's a cycle that happens annually. So why do they migrate? It's generally because of extreme climate, lack of food resources, competition for nesting space, and they're going where the food is for the most part. And this is most notable in birds these days in modern times. At the turn of the century, there were American bison that migrated throughout much of the country, including into Canada and of course Central Texas as well. And of course that's gone now. So birds are kind of our main point of observation for migration in Texas. A lot of these birds are traveling thousands of miles, many of which are going very far from South America, Central Mexico, all the way up into Canada or the Northeast or Pacific Northwest to breed. And there are some birds that actually winter in Texas. So in the winter, instead of going all the way down into South America, for example, to escape the frozen tundras and icy northern conditions, they'll spend time in Texas during the winter. And examples of that are popular and famous: the whooping crane, of course, robins, sparrows, waxwings, and things like that. So actually, a lot of these birds are here now in the winter and taking advantage, even though it's pretty cold outside right now and icy, where I am at least. There's more food here than there is in the frozen north. So some of these birds, they're just passing through Texas on their way up to their northern breeding grounds. But there are a lot of species, hundreds of species, that move into Texas and surrounding states specifically for the habitat here to breed and nest. Here's a picture of the famous golden-cheeked warbler, which is the only songbird in Texas that only breeds and nests within the confines of the state. And this is a bird, one of the many birds that winters down in the mountains of southern and central Mexico. So spring breeders, not all birds migrate. There are a lot of resident species. This is a painted bunting, gorgeous bird. It is not a resident. It is a migratory bird that comes in here kind of like the golden-cheeked warbler. But you think of cardinals, chickadees, titmice, wrens, mockingbird, which is the state bird of Texas. These are residents that are always here. They may move around regionally during the winter and spring for food resources, but they do not typically migrate. But hundreds of species do, and they use a wide variety of habitat types and ecoregions throughout the state. Here's a black Cat Vireo, formerly endangered songbird. Also almost only breeds in Texas, but it does have a little bit of range that goes into New Mexico. And just as a side note, there is another plateau biologist, Danielle, who wrote a great little article called Birds You Can See on Your Property This Spring, back in March of last year. And that is available along with a lot of other our publications and videos and stuff like that on our website. So why is this important to landowners, and how can it affect landowners? It's important to some because it could be considered a beautiful thing that we have all these interesting wildlife species that are using your property, using our land, and traveling these long distances. These little birds traveling these long distances to use the property to forage and nest. So the breeding nesting season, it does have there are some things that landowners can consider that may benefit the birds that are here. And that's what I was referring to earlier about tying it all in together to make sure that it was relevant. So brush management, how that may affect the habitat for the property, for the bird itself. Installing, maintaining nest boxes. Most of the birds here that use nest boxes are not migratory, but there are a few that are. Providing food and water, predator control, like fire ant control. These are all great wildlife management activities that a landowner in this program can utilize to maintain their wildlife valuation, their exemption, but also to benefit specifically songbirds and migratory wildlife. So brush management, brush management, there's not typically a restriction on when or how you should cut your land or sculpt your property. But, we, or myself as a biologist, when I'm consulting with a landowner, I typically recommend try to limit some of it if during spring migration or the breeding season, just to reduce the amount of disturbance that you're inflicting on some of these species. Here's an example, this photo here of a bunch of ash juniper or cedar. Technically it's a juniper growing up under a grove of oak trees. Now, usually I'd recommend a landowner remove a lot of that cedar because it's competing for resources with that oak tree. But it does provide cover. So for the wildlife. So maybe, outside of the breeding nesting season, you could trim a lot of that stuff out of there and then create brush piles in another location. So there is a supplemented source of cover where you lose some cover by clearing, but you're gaining cover elsewhere. So it's a balance there. So loss of habitat cover, but certainly you wouldn't want to lose those oak trees either due to over encroachment or a wildfire because of all that brush that's growing underneath it. So there's also a reduction in forage in some instances where if you're cutting a lot of plants that are providing seed, nectar, or other fruit, other plants that provide food for these birds. So that's an interesting thing to consider as well. And it's really just about timing with brush management. You want the property to be as diverse as possible. You don't want a golf course for wildlife. You want a mosaic of landscape, topography, water resources, and canopy and shrub cover. So reduce heavy cutting, clearing during the breeding season, especially if you live in habitat that could be endangered species habitat. And there's a lot of that in Central Texas. You'll see it in mature juniper oak woodlands of western Travis County, for example. This is not a golden cheek warbler. That's a cuckoo, actually, which is a migratory bird that nests here, and they use similar habitat. So there's other birds that are affected by mature woodland habitat like that. And you'll see, during the breeding nesting season, there are nests that you just may not even see. For example, the hummingbird nest here, the eggs are smaller than a dime. It's just a matter of maybe waiting until the summer or fall or winter later on in the season to do some of the cutting just to reduce the impact. Small selective clearing, reduce machinery, limiting herbicides, looking before you cut. Those are all things that are really viable. Nest boxes, real easy activity. Any landowner with a relatively small acreage, not too big, but you know, where you don't have to have tons of nest boxes on your property. Easy activity to maintain. And you know, this time of the year right now in the winter, before we get into the spring breeding season, it's a good time to clean out those nest boxes. It's a relatively clean looking box, but you see that big wasp nest up there, even though it's not active. That's just an example of why you might want to clean out the old nest, clean out the spider webs, the wasp nests, get it ready for the breeding season, which is coming up soon. Food sources. This picture was taken, I took this picture a few years ago at the Balcones Canyonland National Wildlife Refuge. You know, providing supplemental food through feeders, providing food plots, that's great to do. But the best food comes from the habitat. The land will provide. If it's diverse, if it's healthy, if you've done proper brush management techniques and allowed that land to rest a while from overgrazing livestock and issues like that, a healthy habitat will provide the food that's needed. But you can also provide food through supplemental feed. And then supplemental water. Everything needs water. Small water sources or large water sources, it doesn't matter. It's a qualifying activity under a wildlife management plan, and it benefits wildlife of all kinds. If you do have a trough that's providing a larger source of water, you know, bigger than a bird bath, then, you know, put rocks in it on the inside and the outside. So the smaller critters, like songbirds, they can get to the water, take a drink, take a bath, and get out without drowning. And then predator control. You know, the best time to treat for fire ants, for example, is coming up in the spring when you get a little bit more rain and they just pop up all over the place. And we all know you're not going to ever fully get rid of fire ants, but if you're actively managing them and working on control efforts, then you'll suppress their impact. And that's very important for songbirds of a variety of migratory kinds. But it's also really important for anything that nests on the ground. Rabbits, baby deer, or fawns who bed down, and sometimes they lay down on fire ant mounds, which can be deadly. Wild turkey, quail, you know, these species are drastically impacted by the imported red fire ant, which again is a non-native predator. But there are native predators too. There's raccoons, rat snakes, skunks, squirrels. All of these are, you know, really nuisance species that are native, but they can be problematic. So like when you're checking your nest boxes, make sure rat snakes aren't getting into it and find a way to kind of keep them out. And there's a lot of control efforts that you can implement to reduce some of those mammal, carnivorous or omnivorous predators like that. And of course, feral cats, major impact to songbird populations, as well as lizards, snake, you know, some species people may not love, but snakes and really detrimental to wildlife in general. And another, you know, I mentioned the American bison. There's a species of songbird it's actually a type of a blackbird called the brown-headed cowbird. And these birds used to actually migrate with the bison herds. When the bison were removed and replaced with livestock that do not migrate and they sit still where they are in their pasture, the cowbird stopped migrating, and the problem with that is they're nest parasites. They lay their eggs, excuse me, they lay their eggs in nests of other birds, and those unknowing songbirds actually raise those chicks and are much bigger than a lot of the smaller songbirds, and so it can be very detrimental to those populations. So this is kind of that's kind of like a funny example of how migration was altered accidentally through the loss of the bison and through our own land management regimes. And so that migration stopped, and it affected the landscape greatly and the health of wild populations. Here's a picture of a cactus friend that I took in Arizona. I just thought it was a good one. Another activity, it's again a qualifying wildlife management activity. It can be a lot of fun if you're interested in birds, are bird surveys. where you're conducting annual counts, trying to determine some form of diversity or abundance. And you can kind of use that trend data over the course of years to see how your property is responding, most likely positively, to the wildlife management program. And you get to learn those birds, and it's an effective wildlife management activity, and a lot of people get a kick out of it.